They looked at me like I was a threat. A woman in worn jeans and a faded hoodie, standing in their pristine daycare lobby at 3:47 p.m., 7 minutes before official pickup time. What they didn't know was that in exactly 12 minutes, their entire world was about to shift when someone walked through those doors and said 4 words that would change everything. Major Thompson, your clearance checks out. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I should have known something was wrong the moment I walked into Sunshine Academy that Tuesday afternoon. The way conversations stopped, the way eyes followed me across the polished marble floor, the way the receptionist's smile faltered when I approached her desk like she was seeing something that didn't quite fit. My name is Sarah Thompson, and I'd been picking up my 5-year-old daughter Emma from this daycare for 3 months without incident. 3 months of the same routine. Arrive at 3:45, sign her out, drive home through Atlanta traffic while she chattered about finger painting and playground politics from her car seat. Simple. Normal. The kind of ordinary that I'd fought halfway around the world to protect. But that Tuesday felt different from the moment I pushed through the glass doors with their cheerful yellow frames and cartoon sun decals. The lobby smelled like industrial disinfectant and apple juice, the same as always, but there was tension in the air that made my shoulders tense automatically. Old habits from deployments where tension meant danger, where you learn to read rooms like your life depended on it. The receptionist, a woman in her 30s with perfectly styled blonde hair and a name tag that read Ashley, looked up from her computer screen with what I can only describe as suspicious concern. Not the warm recognition I'd grown accustomed to, not the casual, "how is your day" small talk we usually exchanged, just suspicion wrapped in a thin veneer of professional politeness. "Can I help you?" she asked, though I'd been coming here every weekday for months. Her manicured fingers hovered over her keyboard like she was ready to type something urgent. "I'm here for Emma Thompson," I said, reaching into my back pocket for my wallet. "Pickup time." Ashley's eyes narrowed slightly as she scanned her screen, clicking her mouse several times with unnecessary force. "I don't see you listed as an authorized pickup person." The words hit me like cold water. I'd been picking Emma up every day for 3 months. My name was on every form, every emergency contact list, every piece of paperwork they'd required when I enrolled her. I was her mother. "That's impossible," I said, keeping my voice level despite the alarm bells going off in my head. "I'm her mother, Sarah Thompson. I dropped her off this morning at 7:30. "I'm going to need to see some identification," Ashley said, her tone shifting into something more official, more distant, the kind of voice people use when they're following a script designed to handle problems. I pulled out my driver's license, sliding it across the counter. Ashley examined it like she was checking for forgeries, holding it up to the light and comparing the photo to my face multiple times. Behind me, I could hear other parents arriving for pickup, their conversations a low murmur of normalcy that felt increasingly foreign. "This address doesn't match what we have on file," Ashley announced, though I knew for a fact it did. We'd moved to our current apartment 6 months ago, and I'd updated Emma's information the day I enrolled her. "Check again," I said, forcing patience into my voice. "Sarah Thompson, 1247 Peachtree Gardens Boulevard, apartment 3B. Phone number 404-555-0157. Ashley made a show of typing, her acrylic nails clicking against the keys. Other parents flowed around me, signing out their children with casual ease, while I stood there feeling increasingly like an outsider in a place where I belonged. "Look," I said, trying a different approach, "just call Emma's teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez. She knows me." Ashley picked up the phone with exaggerated reluctance, dialing an extension. "Mrs. Rodriguez? Hi, it's Ashley at the front desk. I have someone here claiming to be Emma Thompson, but I can't verify her authorization." "Uh-huh. Okay, thanks." She hung up and looked at me with something that might have been sympathy if it hadn't felt so condescending. "Mrs. Rodriguez says she's never seen you before." The lie hit me like a physical blow. Mrs. Rodriguez and I had spoken dozens of times about Emma's adjustment to the new school, about her art project, about the incident last week when another child had pushed her down during recess. We'd had a 15-minute conversation just yesterday about Emma's progress with reading. "That's not true," I said, my voice tight with controlled frustration. "Ask her about the reading assessment we discussed yesterday. Ask her about Emma's butterfly painting that she showed me last Thursday." Ashley wasn't listening. She was already looking past me to the next parent in line, a woman in designer jeans, carrying Starbucks and radiating the kind of confidence that comes with never having to prove you belong somewhere. "I'm going to have to ask you to step aside. If you'd like to resolve this issue, you can speak with our director tomorrow during business hours." "Tomorrow?" My voice cracked slightly. "My daughter is here now. I'm her mother. I need to take her home." "Ma'am, we take child safety very seriously here at Sunshine Academy." Ashley's voice had taken on that special tone people use when they want everyone within earshot to know they're dealing with a difficult person. "I'm sure you understand." But I didn't understand. What I understood was that somehow, between this morning's drop-off and this afternoon's pickup, I'd become suspicious, threatening, someone whose relationship to her own child needed to be questioned and verified by strangers. The woman in yoga pants stepped closer to the desk, inserting herself into the conversation with the casual authority of someone accustomed to being heard. "Is everything all right here?" she asked Ashley, though her eyes were fixed on me with unveiled suspicion. "Just a verification issue," Ashley replied with a tight smile. "Nothing we can't handle." "It's just," the woman continued, lowering her voice in a way that was clearly meant to be heard, "I've been coming here for 2 years, and I've never seen her before. And with everything you hear on the news these days about child safety—" She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. The implication hung in the air like smoke. I was dangerous, potentially violent, the kind of person who might try to take someone else's child. I felt the familiar surge of anger that I'd learned to control during 3 deployments in Iraq and Afghanistan, the same anger that came when bureaucrats in air-conditioned offices made decisions about people they'd never met in situations they'd never faced. But this was different. This wasn't about military policy or deployment schedules. This was about my daughter. "Emma Thompson," I said clearly, looking directly at the woman in yoga pants. 5 years old, brown hair, usually wears the purple backpack with the unicorn keychain. She lost her first tooth last week and put it under her pillow for the tooth fairy. She's been excited about show and tell tomorrow because she wants to bring the seashell she found at Tybee Island last weekend. The woman's expression didn't change. If anything, she looked more convinced that I was some kind of threat. Knowledge about a child in her world was evidence of stalking rather than motherhood. "Anyone could know those things," she said, with the casual cruelty of someone who'd never had their fitness as a parent questioned by strangers. Ashley nodded in agreement, emboldened by her audience. "We've had situations before where individuals have attempted to gain access to children by claiming false relationships. It's more common than you'd think." More common than I'd think. As if I were naive about the dangers of the world, as if I hadn't spent years in places where threats were real and immediate, where the difference between friend and enemy could mean life or death. As if I hadn't dedicated my career to protecting people who would never know my name or thank me for the sacrifice. "I understand your concerns about child safety," I said, my voice steady despite the storm building inside me. "But I am Emma's mother. I have been her mother for 5 years. I was her mother when I carried her for 9 months, when I gave birth to her at Northside Hospital, when I got up with her every night for the first year of her life, when I taught her to walk and read and ride a bicycle." "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to calm down." But I wasn't yelling. I wasn't even raising my voice. I was simply speaking with the authority of someone stating facts, and apparently that was threatening enough to require management. The man in the business suit stepped forward, his phone already in his hand. "Should I call security?" he asked Ashley, like I wasn't standing right there. "Let's see if we can resolve this first," Ashley replied, though her hand was still hovering near her phone. That's when I noticed the other children starting to appear in the hallway behind the desk. Pickup time was in full swing, and somewhere in that maze of classrooms and corridors was Emma, probably wondering where I was, probably starting to worry that something had happened to me, the way she worried whenever I was even 5 minutes late. "Please," I said, and I hated the way the word came out, smaller than I intended, more desperate than someone should have to sound when asking to take their own child home. "Just let me talk to Emma. She'll tell you I'm her mother." Ashley exchanged a look with the woman in yoga pants, a silent communication that excluded me entirely. "We can't expose the child to a potentially distressing situation. It wouldn't be fair to her." Potentially distressing. They were worried about distressing my daughter by letting her see her own mother. The irony would have been funny if it hadn't been devastating. "What do you need?" I asked, pulling out my phone. "I have pictures, videos, I have her birth certificate at home, I have medical records, school enrollment forms, insurance paperwork. What exactly do you need to prove that I'm her mother?" "Well," Ashley said slowly, like she was making it up as she went along, "we'd need proper documentation to be verified through official channels. We'd need to contact Child Protective Services to ensure—" Child Protective Services. The words came out louder than I intended, and I saw Ashley's hand move toward her phone again. "You want to call Child Protective Services because you can't find my name in your computer system? Ma'am, please lower your voice. You're creating a scene." But I wasn't creating anything. A scene was being created around me by people who decided I was a threat based on nothing more than a computer glitch and their own assumptions about who belonged in their pristine suburban daycare. I looked around the lobby, taking in the faces staring back at me. Judgment, suspicion, fear. These were people who lived in a world where threats came from strangers, where danger was something that could be identified and managed through proper procedures and background checks.
They couldn't comprehend that sometimes the most dangerous assumption is that you can tell who someone is by looking at them. The man in the business suit had his phone out now, finger poised over the screen. "I really think we should call someone," he said to Ashley. "This situation seems to be escalating." Escalating. I was standing quietly at a desk, asking to pick up my own child, and they were treating it like a hostage situation. "Fine," I said, my voice carrying the kind of calm that comes right before the storm. "Call whoever you need to call. But while you're making your phone calls and checking your procedures, my 5-year-old daughter is sitting in a classroom wondering where her mother is. And when this is all over, when you realize you've made a mistake, I want you to think about how you made a child worry that her parent had abandoned her because you were too lazy to check your own records properly." Ashley's face flushed, but her hand was already reaching for the phone. "I'm calling the director," she announced, like it was a threat. "Good," I said. "Call the director." Because what Ashley didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I'd been waiting my entire adult life for someone in authority to actually check the records, to look beyond the surface and see who I really was, what I'd done, what I'd sacrificed, what I'd earned. I stepped back from the desk and found a position against the wall where I could see the entire lobby. Old habits. In Fallujah, you never put your back to a room full of people whose intentions you couldn't read. In Atlanta, it seemed the same rule applied. The other parents had formed a loose circle around Ashley's desk, creating a buffer between themselves and me, protecting their children from the threat I apparently represented. Their conversations continued in hushed tones, but I caught fragments. "Never seen her before," and "you can't be too careful," and "what if she's dangerous?" Dangerous. They thought I was dangerous because I was asking to take my own child home? If they only knew the truly dangerous things I'd done, the lives I'd taken and saved, the split-second decisions I'd made in places where hesitation meant death. If they only knew what real danger looked like. But they didn't. They saw a woman in faded jeans and scuffed sneakers, someone who didn't fit their image of what a proper Sunshine Academy parent should look like, someone who shopped at Target instead of Nordstrom, who drove a 10-year-old Honda instead of a new BMW, who probably worked for a living instead of managing a household staff. I checked the time on my phone, 4:02 p.m. Emma would be wondering where I was. She was probably watching the door waiting for me to appear with the smile and "How was your day, sweetheart?" that had become our daily ritual. Instead, she was stuck in a classroom while a group of strangers debated whether her mother was fit to take her home. Ashley was on the phone now, speaking in urgent whispers. I couldn't make out the words, but I could read her body language, crisis management mode. She was reporting a situation that needed immediate attention from someone with more authority. The woman in yoga pants had moved closer to her own child, a perfectly groomed little girl in designer clothes, who looked confused by the tension in the air. "Mommy, what's happening?" the child asked, in the clear, carrying voice that only 5-year-olds possess. "Nothing, sweetheart," the woman replied, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Just a misunderstanding. Some people don't understand the rules." Rules. I'd followed every rule they'd ever given me, filled out every form, provided every document, submitted to every background check. I jumped through every hoop required to enroll Emma in their school, and now they were treating me like I'd never existed. Ashley hung up the phone and looked at me with what might have been sympathy if it hadn't been mixed with such obvious relief. "The director is on her way," she announced. "She'll be able to sort this out." Sort this out, like I was a problem to be solved rather than a parent trying to take their child home. I nodded and settled in to wait, because what choice did I have? I could leave, but that would mean abandoning Emma. I could make a scene, but that would only confirm their suspicions about my character. I could demand to speak to a lawyer, but that would take hours and Emma would still be sitting in that classroom, waiting. So I waited, stood against that wall like I'd stood against walls in Baghdad and Kandahar, watching and listening and preparing for whatever came next. The difference was that in Iraq, I knew who the enemy was. Here, I was starting to realize that I might be looking at them. The minutes ticked with agonizing slowness. Other parents continued to arrive, collect their children, and leave with the casual ease of people whose right to their own kids was never questioned. I watched perfect families reunite in the lobby, mothers with designer handbags and fathers with expensive watches, all of them moving through a world where belonging was assumed rather than proven. At 4:08, the director's office door opened, and I knew that whatever happened next would either restore my faith in the system or confirm my worst fears about how the world sees people like me. Because in exactly 4 minutes, someone was going to walk through that door and decide whether I was a threat or a hero, whether I was someone to be feared or someone to be thanked. What they didn't know yet was that I'd been waiting my entire adult life for someone in authority to actually check the records, to look beyond the surface and see who I really was, what I'd done, what I'd sacrificed, what I'd earned. At 4:12, I heard the sound of heels clicking against marble with the kind of purposeful rhythm that meant business. The conversations in the lobby quieted as everyone turned toward the administrative hallway. A woman emerged from the corridor, moving with the confident stride of someone accustomed to handling crises. Director Patricia Wells was younger than I'd expected, maybe mid-40s with auburn hair pulled back in a professional chignon, and the kind of shark navy blazer that suggested she took her authority seriously. But there was something else about her bearing, something in the way she carried her shoulders and scanned the room that made my pulse quicken with recognition. She approached the reception desk with deliberate steps, her eyes taking inventory of the situation, Ashley clutching her phone like a lifeline, the cluster of parents maintaining their protective distance from me, the palpable tension that had transformed the cheerful lobby into something resembling a crime scene. "Ashley," she said, her voice carrying the kind of calm authority that could cut through chaos, "what seems to be the issue here?" Ashley launched into her explanation with the breathless urgency of someone reporting a near catastrophe. "This woman claims to be Emma Thompson's mother, but her information isn't in our system. She doesn't have proper ID, and Mrs. Rodriguez says she's never seen her before. She's been increasingly agitated, and some of our parents are concerned about the safety implications." Director Wells listened without interruption, her expression neutral but her eyes sharp. When Ashley finished, there was a moment of silence that felt like the pause before a verdict. "I see. And you say her name was Sarah Thompson?" Ashley repeated, glancing at me like I might have changed identities in the last 10 minutes. Something shifted in Director Wells' expression. Not surprise exactly, but recognition, the kind of look you get when pieces of a puzzle suddenly click into place. "Sarah Thompson," she repeated, slowly, and I caught the slight change in her tone.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
More thoughtful now, more careful. She turned to face me directly for the first time, her gaze moving from my face to my posture
to the way I stood against the wall with my back straight and my feet positioned for quick movement. Old habits that never quite fade, even in suburban daycare lobbies. "Ma'am," she said, her voice taking on a different quality, "would you mind stepping into my office for a moment? I think we can resolve this situation more efficiently in private." Ashley looked confused by the sudden change in approach. "Director Wells, I really think we should follow protocol and contact the authorities before—" "Ashley," Director Wells interrupted, her tone brooking no argument. "I'll handle this from here. Please return to your regular duties." The woman in yoga pants stepped forward, inserting herself into the conversation with the entitled authority of someone accustomed to being heard. "Excuse me, but as a parent at this school, I think we have a right to know what's going on here. This woman has been acting suspicious, and we're concerned about our children's safety." Director Wells turned to face her with the kind of measured patience that suggested she'd dealt with entitled parents before. "Mrs. Patterson, I appreciate your concern for the children's welfare. However, I'm confident that this situation will be resolved appropriately through proper channels." "But what if she's dangerous?" Mrs. Patterson pressed. "What if she tries to take someone else's child?" For a moment, Director Wells' composed mask slipped, and I saw something flash in her eyes. Irritation, maybe, or recognition of something Mrs. Patterson couldn't begin to understand. "Mrs. Patterson," she said, her voice carrying just enough edge to make the other woman step back, "I can assure you that Miss Thompson poses no threat to the children or staff of this facility. Now, if you'll excuse us, I need to resolve this matter immediately." Miss Thompson. Not Mrs. or Ma'am, but Miss, and she'd said it with the kind of inflection that suggested she knew exactly what that title meant in certain contexts. I followed Director Wells down the hallway, aware of the whispered conversations erupting behind us. Ashley's voice rose above the others. "I don't understand what just happened. She didn't even check the woman's identification." Director Wells' office was at the end of the corridor, behind a door marked with her name in gold lettering. The space was larger than I had expected, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the playground and walls lined with certificates, awards, and photographs. But it was the American flag in the corner and the small display case containing military challenge coins that made my breath catch. "Please have a seat," Director Wells said, closing the door behind us with a soft click. The sudden quiet was almost startling after the tension of the lobby. I remained standing, old habits keeping me alert, even in what should have been a safe space. Director Wells noticed my posture and nodded with what looked like approval. "You can relax, Major," she said quietly. "This is friendly territory." The word hit me like electricity. Major. She'd called me Major, not Ma'am or Miss Thompson. Major. The rank I'd earned through 8 years of service, 3 deployments, and more difficult decisions than I cared to remember. "How did you—" I started to ask, but she was already moving toward her desk, pulling out a tablet and typing with quick, efficient strokes. "Military bearing is hard to hide," she said without looking up. "The way you positioned yourself against the wall, the way you scan rooms, the way you hold yourself, even when you're under pressure. Plus, the fact that Ashley couldn't find you in our standard database was the first clue." She turned the tablet screen toward me, and I saw a government interface I recognized, the Department of Defense Personnel Verification System. My photograph stared back at me from the screen, along with information that made my civilian identity suddenly make sense. Major Sarah Elizabeth Thompson, United States Army, Military Intelligence, 3 tours in Iraq and Afghanistan. Currently assigned to Fort McPherson Liaison Office. Security clearance level, secret. Emergency contact, Emma Thompson, daughter, age 5. The relief was so sudden and overwhelming that I had to sit down. For the first time in an hour, someone was seeing me as I really was, instead of as they assumed I must be. "The reason Ashley couldn't find you in our standard database is because military families with active security clearances are maintained in a separate database for protection purposes.
Your daughter's records are flagged to prevent unauthorized access or identification." She paused, looking at me with something that might have been sympathy. "Which means that Ashley should have recognized the flag and contacted me immediately instead of treating you like a potential threat." I found my voice, though it came out rougher than I intended. "Mrs. Rodriguez said she'd never seen me before." Director Wells picked up her desk phone and dialed an extension. "Maria, it's Patricia. Can you come to my office for a moment? We need to discuss the Thompson account." A pause. "Yes, immediately." While we waited, Director Wells moved to a small refrigerator in the corner of her office and pulled out 2 bottles of water, offering me one with a gesture that felt like an apology. For what it's worth, I'm former Navy myself, served 6 years before transitioning to civilian education. I recognize the signs because I've lived them. That explained the bearing, the challenge coins, the way she'd handled the situation with calm authority instead of panic. Military to military, professional to professional. A soft knock interrupted my thoughts, and Mrs. Rodriguez entered the office. She was a small woman in her 50s, with kind eyes and paint-stand fingers, exactly as I remembered her from our daily conversations about Emma's progress. "You wanted to see me?" Mrs. Rodriguez asked, then stopped short when she saw me sitting in the chair. Her face went through a series of expressions: confusion, recognition, and then something that looked like horror. "Maria," Director Wells said gently, "do you recognize this woman?" Mrs. Rodriguez stared at me for a long moment, her hands fluttering nervously at her sides. She looks familiar, but..." "This is Sarah Thompson, Emma's mother, the woman you told Ashley you'd never seen before?" The color drained from Mrs. Rodriguez's face. "Oh my God," she whispered. "I thought... When Ashley called, she said someone was claiming to be Emma's mother, and I thought she meant someone else. I thought someone was trying to impersonate..." She trailed off, the implications of her mistake becoming clear. "Sarah, I'm so sorry. I didn't understand what Ashley was asking. When she said someone claiming to be Emma's mother, I thought she meant a stranger, not you. I would never... Emma talks about you constantly. You're all she talks about." The pieces were falling into place now. The miscommunication that had cascaded into an hour of humiliation and suspicion. Ashley had asked the wrong question. Mrs. Rodriguez had misunderstood the situation, and I'd been caught in the middle of their institutional failure. "Where is Emma now?" I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. "She's in my classroom," Mrs. Rodriguez said quickly. "She's been asking for you. She knows something's wrong because pickup time was 20 minutes ago." Director Wells stood up, her expression shifting into command mode. "Maria, please bring Emma here immediately. And when you do, I want you to apologize to both her and her mother for the confusion you've caused." Mrs. Rodriguez nodded and hurried out of the office, leaving Director Wells and me alone again. The silence stretched between us, filled with everything that had happened and everything that still needed to be addressed. "I need to ask you something," Director Wells said finally, "and I need you to be completely honest with me." I nodded, bracing myself for whatever question was coming. "How are you doing? Really doing? The transition back to civilian life, single parenthood, the stress of maintaining your clearance while trying to blend into suburban normalcy. How are you handling it all?" The question cut me off guard, not because it was inappropriate, but because it was the first time in months that someone had asked about me rather than about what I could do for them. "Some days are harder than others," I admitted. "The routine helps. Emma helps. Having a purpose beyond just surviving." "And days like today?" I considered the question carefully. Days like today remind me why I got out, why I chose civilian life over a military career, because I wanted Emma to grow up in a world where people are presumed innocent until proven guilty, where your value isn't determined by your rank or your security clearance. Director Wells nodded slowly. "And instead, you found a world where your value is determined by your zip code and your handbag." Before I could respond, the office door opened and Emma burst in with the kind of energy that only 5-year-olds possess.
She saw me and ran straight into my arms, her small body fitting perfectly against mine in the way that made every sacrifice feel worthwhile. "Mommy," she said, her voice muffled against my shoulder. "Mrs. Rodriguez said there was a problem, but I knew you would come. I always know you'll come." I held her tighter than necessary, breathing in the scent of finger paint and playground dust that clung to her hair. This was why I'd served. This was why I'd come home. This moment, this child, this simple certainty that I would always be there for her. Mrs. Rodriguez appeared in the doorway, her face still pale with embarrassment. "Emma, sweetheart, I need to apologize to you and your mommy. There was a big misunderstanding today, and I said something that wasn't true. Your mommy is wonderful, and I'm sorry if I made you worry." Emma looked confused, but accepted the apology with the easy forgiveness of childhood. "It's okay, Mrs. Rodriguez. Mommy says everybody makes mistakes sometimes." Director Wells watched this exchange with the careful attention of someone taking mental notes. When Emma turned her attention to exploring the office, Director Wells caught my eye and mouthed silently, "We need to talk." She said aloud, "Emma, would you like to go get your backpack and artwork from Mrs. Rodriguez's classroom? I need to speak with your mother for just a few more minutes." Emma nodded eagerly and followed Mrs. Rodriguez out of the office, chattering about the clay sculpture she'd made that morning. When they were gone, Director Wells closed the door again and returned to her seat. "I need to address what happened today," she said without preamble.
Both the systemic failures that led to the situation and the individual behaviors that made it worse. I waited, curious to see how she would handle the institutional reckoning that was clearly coming. First, Ashley will be undergoing additional training on our military family protocols. The fact that she didn't recognize the database flag and escalated the situation inappropriately shows a gap in her knowledge that needs immediate correction. She paused, checking something on her tablet. Second, Mrs. Rodriguez will be participating in communication training to ensure she understands the importance of asking clarifying questions before making statements that affect a family's welfare. And third? I asked, sensing there was more. Third, I'm implementing a new policy requiring all staff to complete military family sensitivity training within the next 30 days. Too many of our employees don't understand the unique challenges faced by military families, and that ignorance creates unnecessary obstacles for parents like you. It was more than I'd expected, certainly more than I'd hoped for when I walked into the building an hour ago. But there was something else in her expression, something that suggested she wasn't finished. "There's one more thing," she said, leaning forward slightly. "I've been looking for someone to help develop our military family support program, someone who understands both the military experience and the challenges of civilian integration, someone with the authority and credibility to make real changes." I felt a familiar flutter in my chest, the same feeling I'd gotten when presented with a mission that mattered more than routine bureaucracy. "What kind of program?" I asked. "Comprehensive support for military families transitioning to civilian life, educational resources, social connections, advocacy services, crisis intervention, the kind of program that ensures what happened today never happens again, not just here but at similar institutions throughout the community." She pulled out a folder from her desk drawer and slid it across to me. "I've been working on this for months, but I need someone with operational experience to make it effective. Someone who's lived the challenges we're trying to address." I opened the folder and scanned the contents: program outlines, budget projections, partnership agreements with local military organizations. It was comprehensive, well-researched, and exactly the kind of initiative that could make a real difference for families like mine. "Why me?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. "Because you handled today with grace under pressure. Because you didn't lose your temper when you had every right to be furious. Because you understand that systemic change requires both strategic thinking and tactical execution." She gestured toward the folder. "And because Emma's experience here today could have been very different if we'd had better systems in place. And there are hundreds of other military children in this district who deserve better than what we're currently providing." Emma's voice echoed from the hallway as she returned with Mrs. Rodriguez, chattering excitedly about taking her clay turtle home to show me. At that moment,
I realized that Director Wells was right. This wasn't just about my experience or Emma's experience. It was about creating a community where military families were seen as assets rather than problems, where service was recognized rather than questioned. "I don't need to think about it," I said suddenly. "I'm interested. When do we start?" Director Wells smiled, and for the first time since I'd walked into the building, I felt like I was exactly where I belonged. As we prepared to leave her office, she had one final question. "Can I ask you something personal?" I nodded. "When you were standing in that lobby, being questioned and dismissed by people who should have known better, what kept you from losing your composure? What kept you from walking away?" I thought about it for a moment, considering all the possible answers: military training, maternal instinct, stubborn pride. But the real answer was simpler than that. Emma was counting on me, and I've never let her down before. I wasn't about to start today. Director Wells nodded with the understanding of someone who'd faced similar choices. "That's exactly why this program needs you leading it, because you understand that sometimes the most important battles are fought in places like daycare lobbies, where the stakes feel small, but the principles are everything." As we walked back toward the lobby to collect Emma and her belongings, I felt the familiar satisfaction of a mission well executed. Not the dramatic victory of combat operations, but the quieter triumph of systemic change initiated by someone who refused to accept that things had to stay the way they were. The lobby looked different now. Ashley was still at her desk, but her confident demeanor had been replaced by nervous uncertainty. The parents who had clustered around her earlier were gone, replaced by a new group who looked at me with curiosity rather than suspicion. Mrs. Patterson was still there, helping her daughter with a stubborn zipper, but she avoided eye contact when Director Wells and I emerged from the hallway. Some battles, I'd learned, were won not through confrontation, but through the simple demonstration of authority recognizing authority. Emma ran to me with her backpack and a handful of artwork, including the clay turtle she was so excited to show me. As we gathered her things and prepared to leave, I realized that this ordinary Tuesday afternoon had become something else entirely, the beginning of a new mission, a new purpose, a new way to serve. "Mommy," Emma said, as we walked toward the exit, "Mrs. Rodriguez said you're going to help make the school better for other kids like me." "Maybe," I said, squeezing her hand. "Would you like that?" She considered the question with the seriousness that children bring to important matters. "I think it would be good," she said finally, "because everybody should feel safe when their mommy comes to pick them up." Out of the mouths of babes. Sometimes the most complex problems have the simplest solutions, and the most important truths come from people who see the world without the filters of assumption and prejudice. As we pushed through the glass doors into the late afternoon sunlight, I felt the weight of the folder in my other hand and the responsibility it represented. Tomorrow, I would begin the work of ensuring that no other military parent would have to stand in that lobby, proving their right to their own child. Today, I was just a mother taking her daughter home. But tomorrow, I would be something more: an advocate, a leader, a bridge between two worlds that too often fail to understand each other. And for the first time since leaving the military, I felt like I was exactly where I belonged. 6 months later, I stood in the same lobby where I'd once been treated like a threat, watching a scene that would have been impossible before. A young father in desert camouflage was checking in his twin daughters for their first day at Sunshine Academy, and instead of suspicion, he was being greeted with understanding.
"Sergeant Morrison," Ashley said, her voice warm with genuine respect as she pulled up his file on her computer. "Welcome to Sunshine Academy. I see you're just back from deployment. How are the girls adjusting to having Dad home?" The transformation hadn't happened overnight. It had taken months of training sessions, policy revisions, and careful relationship building to create the culture shift that was now evident in every interaction. But watching Sergeant Morrison's face relax as Ashley spoke to him with knowledge and respect rather than suspicion made every late-night planning session worth the effort. The Military Family Excellence Program had officially launched 3 months ago, but its impact was already visible throughout the facility. The lobby now featured a wall of service, displaying photographs and brief biographies of military families currently enrolled at the school. New staff orientation included comprehensive training on military culture, deployment cycles, and the unique challenges faced by service members and their families. Most importantly, the database system had been completely overhauled to ensure that military families' information was properly flagged and accessible to authorized personnel. No more mysterious disappearances from the system, no more treating parents like strangers to their own children. I watched from my position near the Family Resource Center as Sergeant Morrison's daughters, perhaps 4 and 5 years old, clung to his legs with the desperate attachment that comes after months of separation. Ashley noticed too, and instead of rushing the check-in process, she came around from behind the desk to kneel at the girl's eye level. "You know what?" she said conspiratorially. "We have a special tradition here for military families. Would you like to see the hero board?" She led them to a display near the entrance that hadn't existed 6 months ago, a collection of photos, letters, and artwork created by children whose parents served in the military. It was Emma's idea, actually, born from her desire to share her pride in my service with her classmates. "Every child with a military parent gets to add something to this board," Ashley explained to the twins. "It's our way of saying thank you to families like yours." The girls' grip on their father's uniform loosened slightly as they examined the display with growing interest. This was intentional, of course, part of the transition protocol we developed to help military children feel valued rather than different. Director Wells emerged from her office, making her rounds as she did every morning. When she saw me observing the interaction, she approached with the satisfied expression of someone watching a plan come together. "Another successful integration," she said quietly. "That's the 14th military family we've enrolled since the program launched." "Word travels fast in military communities," I replied. "When people hear that there's a place where their service is recognized rather than questioned, they make the effort to get here." It was true. Families were transferring from other facilities across the district, drawn by reports of a daycare that actually understood military life. Parents no longer had to choose between quality care and cultural competency. "The school board wants to expand the program district-wide," Director Wells continued. "They're asking for a presentation next month about implementing similar protocols at all 18 facilities." I nodded, already mentally preparing for the challenge of scaling our success across multiple locations. It would require training hundreds of staff members, revising policies at the district level, and maintaining quality control across diverse communities. But the need was clearly there. "There's something else," Director Wells said, lowering her voice. "Channel 5 News wants to do a feature story on the program. They're calling it a model for military family support in civilian institutions." I felt the familiar tension that came with media attention. My military background had taught me to value operational security over public recognition, and the idea of cameras and interviews made me uncomfortable. "They specifically requested to interview you," she continued, "as the program director and a military parent who experienced the problems firsthand." Before I could respond, a commotion near the entrance caught my attention. A woman in civilian clothes was arguing with the security guard, her voice rising with frustration. Behind her, a boy of perhaps 6 years old clutched a Star Wars backpack and watched the interaction with the wide-eyed anxiety that comes from seeing adults in conflict. "Ma'am, I understand your concern, but I need proper identification before I can allow you on the premises." "I am his mother," she insisted, her voice carrying the edge of someone who'd been through this conversation before. "I pick him up every day. Ask anyone." I recognized the signs immediately. Another military family caught in bureaucratic confusion. The woman's posture, her careful control despite obvious frustration, the way she positioned herself protectively in front of her child. I'd stood in that exact spot 6 months ago, facing the same skepticism and institutional barriers. "Excuse me," I said, approaching the situation with the calm authority I'd learned to project during crisis situations. "Is there a problem here?" The security guard, a man I didn't recognize who must have been recently hired, looked relieved to see someone with apparent authority. "This woman claims to be here for child pickup, but her name isn't in our standard visitor system." "What's your child's name?" I asked the woman directly. "Marcus Pillips," she said, her jaw tight with controlled anger. "I'm Staff Sergeant Jennifer Pillips, and I've been picking him up every day for 2 months." "Staff Sergeant."
I pulled out my phone and opened the military family database we had created, entering her information quickly. Her profile appeared immediately. Jennifer Phillips, Army National Guard, recently returned from a 9-month deployment to Kuwait. Single mother, son enrolled under special protection protocols due to her security clearance. Staff Sergeant Phillips, I said, and I saw her shoulders straighten slightly at the recognition of her rank. I'm Sarah Thompson, Military Family Program Director. There seems to be a misunderstanding about our check-in procedures. I turned to the security guard with the authoritative smile that makes it clear someone is about to receive education rather than criticism. This is a military family under our special protocols. Staff Sergeant Phillips has full access to the facility for her son's pickup. In the future, any questions about military families should be directed immediately to myself or Director Wells. The guard nodded quickly, stepping aside to allow Jennifer and Marcus to pass. But Jennifer didn't move immediately. She was studying my face with the careful attention military personnel pay to situations that don't quite make sense. Did you just call yourself the Military Family Program Director? I did. It's a new position, created to ensure that situations like this don't happen to families like ours. Families like ours, she repeated, and I could see her processing the implications. You're military. Army, 8 years, 3 deployments? Her expression shifted from suspicion to understanding to something that looked like relief. Someone who actually gets it. Someone who's been exactly where you're standing, and who's working to make sure no other military parent has to fight these battles alone.
Marcus tugged on his mother's hand, eager to begin pickup routine and escape the awkward adult conversation. Jennifer squeezed his hand reassuringly, but kept her attention focused on me. "How long has this program been running?" she asked. 3 months officially, but we've been developing the protocols for the better part of a year. Training staff, revising policies, building partnerships with military support organizations. She looked around the lobby, taking in the wall of service, the Family Resource Center, the obvious comfort with which other military families moved through the space. "I've been dealing with attitude and confusion at pickup for 2 months," she said quietly. "Constant questions about my authorization, sideways looks from other parents, my son asking why people treat mommy differently here than at other places." "That ends today," I said simply. "Marcus, would you like to add something to our hero board before you go home?" The boy's eyes lit up with interest, and Jennifer looked at me with the kind of gratitude that comes from having someone understand not just your situation, but your child's experience of it. As I helped Marcus select artwork supplies to create his contribution to the hero board, I reflected on how many similar moments I'd witnessed over the past few months. Each one represented a family that no longer had to prove their worth, a child who could take pride in their parents' service, a community that was slowly learning to see military families as assets rather than anomalies. The afternoon pickup proceeded smoothly, with military and civilian families moving through the same spaces with equal ease. This had been one of our key objectives: integration rather than segregation, understanding rather than tolerance. Emma emerged from her classroom with her usual end-of-day energy, chattering about a science project involving volcanoes and baking soda. She'd grown accustomed to seeing me at work in her school, and she took obvious pride in introducing me to other children whose parents served in the military. "Mommy," she said, as we gathered her belongings, "Marcus says his mom is a soldier too. I told him you could show her the photo wall." The photo wall was another of Emma's innovations, a display featuring pictures of military parents in uniform alongside photos of them in civilian family life. It helped children understand that their parents' service was just one part of who they were, while also helping other families recognize the diversity of military experience. "That's a good idea, sweetheart," I said. "Marcus and his mom might like to add their own photos to the collection." As we prepared to leave, Director Wells approached with the satisfied expression she wore when reviewing successful program metrics. "Jennifer Phillips just filled out a family satisfaction survey," she said quietly. perfect scores across all categories, with a note that this was the first time she'd felt welcome at a civilian institution since returning from deployment. These surveys had become an important tool for measuring our success and identifying areas for improvement. The feedback was consistently positive, but more importantly, it was specific. Families weren't just satisfied with the service, they felt understood, respected, and valued. The Regional Military Family Advocacy Group wants to tour our facility next week. They're considering recommending us as a model for implementation at other installations. The recognition was gratifying, but what mattered more was the practical impact. Military families throughout the region were beginning to see Sunshine Academy as a place where they belonged, rather than a place they had to navigate carefully. That evening, as Emma and I worked on homework at our kitchen table, she looked up from her math worksheet with the serious expression she wore when contemplating important matters. "Mommy, do you think other kids understand what their parents do at work?" It was a profound question from a 5-year-old, and it made me consider how unique Emma's perspective had become. She not only understood that I'd served in the military, but she also saw how that service connected to my current work helping other military families. "Some do," I said carefully, "but not all children have parents whose work is easy to explain. Like doctors and teachers and firefighters," she said, nodding with understanding. "Those are easy, but military is harder because it's not just a job, right?" "Right. It's a way of serving your country and protecting other people." She considered this for a moment, then returned to her math problems with the matter-of-fact acceptance that children bring to complex concepts when they're explained honestly. Later that night, after Emma was asleep, I sat at my computer reviewing applications for the expanded program. The school board had approved funding for district-wide implementation, and we were beginning the process of recruiting and training staff for 18 additional facilities. Each application represented a family that could benefit from the understanding and support we'd developed at Sunshine Academy. Parents who wouldn't have to prove their fitness for their own children, children who could take pride in their family's service, communities that would learn to see military families as assets rather than anomalies. The phone rang at 9:30, late enough that I wondered if it might be a work emergency. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but the area code was local. "Sarah Thompson," I answered professionally. "Ms. Thompson, this is Captain Rodriguez from the Georgia National Guard Family Readiness Group. I hope I'm not calling too late." "Not at all, Captain. How can I help you?" "We've been hearing remarkable things about your Military Family Excellence program at Sunshine Academy. Our families are requesting information about enrollment, and we're wondering if you might be available to speak at our next family support meeting." It was the third such call I had received that week. Word was spreading through military networks faster than I'd anticipated, carried by families who'd experienced the difference that understanding and respect could make in their daily lives. "I'd be honored to speak with your families. When is your next meeting?" As I scheduled the presentation and took notes about the specific challenges facing National Guard families, I reflected on how far we'd come from that afternoon 6 months ago when I'd stood in a lobby being treated like a threat to my own child. The work was expanding beyond anything I'd originally envisioned. What had started as a response to one family's negative experience was becoming a model for military family support across multiple communities. But the core mission remained the same, ensuring that service members and their families received the respect and understanding they'd earned through their sacrifice. 3 weeks later, I stood before an audience of 200 military families at the Georgia International Convention Center, delivering a presentation about the Military Family Excellence Program to representatives from schools, daycares, and community organizations across the Southeast. "The question isn't whether military families have unique needs," I said, advancing to a slide showing survey results from participating institutions. "The question is whether civilian institutions are prepared to meet those needs with understanding rather than suspicion." The data told a compelling story. Military families served by trained, culturally competent staff reported higher satisfaction levels, better communication with teachers and administrators, and improved social integration for their children. But more importantly, civilian staff reported increased job satisfaction and better relationships with all families, not just military ones. The Regional Military Family Advocacy Group wants to tour our facility next week. They're considering recommending us as a model for implementation at other installations. The recognition was gratifying, but what mattered more was the practical impact. Military families throughout the region were beginning to see Sunshine Academy as a place where they belonged, rather than a place they had to navigate carefully. During the question and answer session that followed, a woman in the front row raised her hand. She identified herself as a daycare director from South Carolina who was struggling with similar issues as those we'd addressed at Sunshine Academy. How do you handle resistance from staff who don't understand why military families need special consideration? She asked. It was a question I'd anticipated because we'd encountered similar resistance during our early implementation phase. We don't frame it as special consideration. We frame it as professional competency. Just like we train staff to understand developmental differences in children or cultural differences in families, we train them to understand the military experience as one of many backgrounds they'll encounter in their work. But what about staff who think military families are just looking for special treatment? We address that directly through education and exposure. Staff resistance usually comes from lack of understanding, not malice. When people learn about deployment cycles, frequent relocations, the stress of maintaining security clearances, and the challenges of transitioning between military and civilian environments, they begin to see support as necessary rather than preferential.
Each carried similar stories. Military families struggling to find civilian institutions that understood their needs, children caught between military and civilian cultures, parents feeling isolated in communities that didn't recognize their service. But they also carried hope. The success at Sunshine Academy had proven that change was possible, that civilian institutions could learn to serve military families effectively while maintaining their commitment to all families in their care. On the drive back to Atlanta, I called Director Wells to update her on the response to the presentation. 12 school districts have requested consultation services, I reported. 4 want to implement pilot programs this fall, and 2 are asking about staff training workshops. That's incredible, she replied. But can we handle that level of expansion while maintaining quality control? It was a valid concern. Rapid growth could dilute the careful attention to detail that had made our program successful. But the need was clearly there, and we had a responsibility to share what we'd learned. I think we need to develop a train-the-trainer model, I said. Identify key personnel at each location who can become local experts and ongoing resources for their communities. Military families helping military families? Exactly. Who better to understand the challenges and advocate for solutions? That conversation led to the development of our Military Family Ambassador program, which launched 6 months later. Military parents from participating institutions received training in advocacy, communication, and implementation, then returned to their communities as local resources and change agents. Emma, now 6 and in kindergarten, had become something of an expert on military family issues herself. She could explain to other children why some parents wore uniforms, why some families moved frequently, and why some children had parents who traveled far away for work. My mommy helps other mommies and daddies who serve our country, she told her class during a career day presentation. She makes sure their kids feel safe and happy at school, just like I do. The simple clarity of a child's perspective often captured complex concepts better than any professional presentation. Emma understood that her mother's work was about helping families feel like they belonged, and she took pride in being part of that mission. 2 years after that first confrontation in the Sunshine Academy lobby, I received a call that brought the transformation full circle. Ashley, the receptionist who had initially dismissed me, was on the line with news that she'd been promoted to Assistant Family Services Coordinator at a new facility across town.
"I wanted to thank you," she said, her voice carrying none of the skepticism I remembered from our first encounter. "The training and experience I gained working with military families has changed my entire approach to family services. I understand now what I didn't understand then." "What's that?" I asked. "That everyone who walks through our doors has a story, and our job is to listen to that story rather than assume we already know it." It was a simple lesson, but one that had taken months of training and real-world practice to internalize. Ashley's transformation represented hundreds of similar changes in perspective across the institutions where we'd implemented the program. "My new facility wants to implement the Military Family Excellence Program," she continued. "Would you be available for a consultation visit?" As I scheduled yet another site visit and training session, I reflected on how one family's negative experience had generated systemic change that was now benefiting thousands of families across multiple states. The program had grown beyond anything I'd imagined possible, but its core mission remained unchanged: ensuring that military families received the respect and support they'd earned through their service, their sacrifice, and their commitment to protecting the freedoms we all enjoy.
Like Captain Martinez, whose son had stopped asking why other parents seemed afraid of his mother's uniform. Like Sergeant First Class Johnson, whose daughter now led her school's monthly military appreciation assembly instead of hiding her father's deployment photos. After the presentation, a young woman approached me with the familiar posture of someone carrying the weight of military service. She introduced herself as Lieutenant Sarah Kim, recently returned from deployment and struggling to find childcare that understood her unpredictable schedule and security clearance requirements. "I've been to 6 different facilities," she said, her voice tight with controlled frustration. "Every one treats me like I'm trying to work the system instead of just trying to work." I handed her a directory we'd developed listing certified Military Family Excellence Program locations across the country. "Try the facility on Riverside Drive," I suggested. "Ask for Monica at the front desk and tell her Major Thompson recommended them." The look of hope that crossed her face reminded me why this work mattered beyond policy papers and conference presentations. Real families needed real solutions, and we'd created a network of institutions prepared to provide them. That evening, as the conference wound down and attendees prepared to return to their communities with new knowledge and renewed commitment, Director Wells found me in the now empty lobby where our journey had begun. "Any regrets?" she asked, gesturing toward the space that had once been the site of my humiliation but had become the launching point for transformative change. I considered the question seriously. The past 5 years had been demanding, requiring travel, late nights, difficult conversations, and the constant challenge of scaling personal experience into systemic reform. But watching Lieutenant Kim walk out with genuine hope in her eyes, seeing Emma's confidence in her identity as a military child, knowing that thousands of families no longer face the barriers we'd encountered, made every sacrifice worthwhile. "Only one," I said finally. "I regret that it took a crisis to create change instead of proactive recognition that military families deserve better." As I gathered my materials and prepared to head home, I noticed a new addition to the wall of service: a photograph of myself in dress uniform alongside Emma, both of us smiling with the easy confidence of people who know they belong exactly where they are. The plaque beneath read simply, "Major Sarah Thompson, U.S. Army Program Founder. Service continues." Because it does continue, in every conversation that builds understanding, in every policy that recognizes sacrifice, in every moment when someone chooses to see beyond assumptions and acknowledge the humanity and heroism of those who serve. The little girl who once worried about her mother's late pickup now understood that some delays lead to life-changing opportunities. The dismissed parent had become a national advocate. The institutional failure had sparked systemic reform. Sometimes the most important victories happen not on battlefields, but in ordinary places where extraordinary courage meets everyday prejudice and chooses to fight for something better. Sometimes the hero's journey begins with a simple refusal to accept that things have to stay the way they are.
And sometimes, if you're lucky enough and stubborn enough and principled enough to keep pushing, you get to stand in the same place where you once felt powerless and realize that you've helped create a world where no other family will have to fight the battles you fought. The invisible divide between military and civilian communities represents one of America's most overlooked social challenges. While we celebrate our veterans during parades and holidays, the daily reality for military families navigating civilian institutions often tells a different story, one marked by misunderstanding, suspicion, and institutional barriers that transform routine interactions into battles for basic respect. Military families face unique challenges that civilian communities frequently fail to recognize or accommodate. The constant relocations that define military life mean children may attend 6 or 7 different schools. Parents must repeatedly establish credibility with new institutions, and families rarely develop the deep community roots that civilian families take for granted. When a military spouse arrives at a new daycare or school, they're not just another parent enrolling their child. They're starting from zero in proving their legitimacy, reliability, and fitness as a guardian. The security clearance requirements that protect national interests create additional complications in civilian settings. Military families often maintain separate database records, restricted contact information, and communication protocols that can appear suspicious to civilian administrators unfamiliar with military procedures. A parent whose child suddenly disappears from standard enrollment systems isn't necessarily trying to circumvent procedures. They may simply be protected by security measures designed to safeguard military operations and personnel. The psychological toll of deployment cycles extends beyond the obvious challenges of family separation. Military children develop different coping mechanisms, attachment patterns, and social skills compared to their civilian peers. A child who has learned to say goodbye to a deploying parent multiple times may struggle with separation anxiety in new environments, while another child who has moved frequently may have difficulty forming deep friendships. These behavioral differences can be misinterpreted by civilian educators as evidence of instability or poor parenting, rather than natural adaptations to military life. Cultural disconnection compounds these practical challenges. Military families operate within a culture that values hierarchy, protocol, direct communication, and collective responsibility. Civilian institutions, particularly in affluent communities, may prioritize individual achievement, informal networking, and social connections that military families struggle to access or navigate. A military parent who communicates with the directness valued in military settings may be perceived as aggressive or confrontational by civilian staff accustomed to more indirect communication styles. The appearance of military families can also trigger unconscious biases in civilian environments. A parent arriving in uniform may be viewed as intimidating rather than professional. A parent in civilian clothes who carries themselves with military bearing may seem overly formal or rigid. Military families often find themselves caught between standing out as obviously military and blending in by hiding their service, neither option providing the comfort and acceptance that should be available to all families. Economic factors create additional barriers to integration. Military families, particularly enlisted personnel, may have different spending priorities and financial constraints compared to civilian families in similar communities. A parent who budgets carefully for necessities rather than discretionary spending on school fundraisers or optional activities may be viewed as unsupportive or uninvested in their child's education. The assumption that all parents have similar financial flexibility creates subtle but persistent exclusion for military families managing deployment pay fluctuations and frequent moving expenses. The spouse employment challenges that plague military families extend into community integration. Military spouses face unemployment rates significantly higher than their civilian counterparts due to frequent relocations, security clearance complications, and the demands of military life. A parent who cannot participate in daytime volunteer activities or attend weekday conferences may be viewed as disengaged rather than constrained by employment or spouse deployment schedules. Geographic isolation compounds these challenges for military families stationed in communities with limited military presence. While families near major bases benefit from shared understanding and mutual support, those stationed in predominantly civilian areas may find themselves the only military family in their school or daycare.
Without peer support and institutional familiarity with military culture, these families face even greater pressure to explain, justify, and defend their lifestyle choices and constraints. The solution requires systematic education and cultural competency training for civilian institutions serving military families. Just as organizations train staff to serve families with diverse ethnic, linguistic, or socioeconomic backgrounds, they must develop expertise in military culture and family structures. This means understanding deployment cycles, recognizing security requirements, accommodating military schedules, and celebrating military service as a valuable form of community contribution. Successful integration programs focus on building bridges rather than creating separate systems. Military families don't want special treatment. They want appropriate treatment based on understanding their unique circumstances. This includes flexible communication channels for deployed parents, recognition of military moves as legitimate reasons for enrollment gaps, and acknowledgement that military children bring valuable perspectives and experiences to civilian environments. The broader community benefits when military families feel welcomed and valued. Military children often demonstrate resilience, adaptability, and global awareness that enrich classroom discussions and peer relationships. Military parents bring leadership skills, crisis management experience, and diverse perspectives that strengthen parent organizations and community groups. Military families contribute economic stability and civic engagement when they feel connected to their temporary communities. Creating inclusive environments for military families requires intentional effort and ongoing commitment. Civilian institutions must examine their policies, procedures, and cultural assumptions to identify barriers that may not be immediately obvious. Staff training should include military cultural competency alongside other diversity initiatives. Communication materials should acknowledge and celebrate military families as valued community members rather than temporary residents or special cases requiring accommodation. The stakes extend beyond individual family satisfaction to national security and military readiness. When military families struggle with civilian integration, service members face additional stress that can impact their performance and retention. Children who feel excluded or stigmatized in civilian schools may develop negative associations with military life that influence future career decisions and community engagement.